Hello wonderful person, this is Anton and yep, I'm wearing a hat. But not just any hat, a Kodak hat. And I bet you don't have one of those. But this is not a sponsored video, this is actually a really important segue into the topic we're discussing today. We're actually going to be discussing this really intriguing story about Kodak, a really intriguing astronomical study we've recently talked about involving strange vanishing stars, some really intriguing Cold War secrets, and a fascinating cosmic mystery that we're going to try to resolve by using common sense and a little bit of science. And so today, once again, we're going to be discussing these vanishing transients, or these somewhat strange vanishing stars, or technically mysterious star-like objects, that appeared in some of the historical photographic plates in the early 1950s, only to disappear without a trace during the follow-up observations. And so what were they? Were these bizarre celestial phenomena, or perhaps even something more mysterious and something more exotic? Or could the answer to this question perhaps be just a little bit more mundane and a little bit more down to earth? And so let's discuss this study and a few more studies and a few more reports in a little bit more detail in order to possibly figure out what's really happening here. Although at least for now I'm going to take off this hat because it's like super hot and super uncomfortable. And so anyway, for years this project known as VASCO, or Vanishing and Appearing Sources During a Century of Observations, meticulously analyzed different images from observatories responsible for creating some of the first detailed surveys of the night skies by using the Palomar Observatory you see right here. But in this particular project, in this project VASCO, a team of researchers is essentially hunting for just one thing: objects that seem to vanish in between different plates. And here they've actually discovered quite a few, potentially thousands. But what makes some of them really intriguing is that there seem to be even groups where multiple transients seem to appear and vanish within the same part of the night skies. Here's one of the examples, containing multiple candidates. And because these plates were exposed for approximately 40 to 50 minutes, it means that within about 50 minutes, these objects disappeared. And so here imagine a star-like object visible on one plate, but completely absent in the next one approximately half an hour later, and actually absent in pretty much all additional surveys conducted in the last few decades. And there are quite a few examples they provide in these studies, where these objects are visible on one side and are absent on the other. But I think it was actually this observation that we discussed in one of the videos in the description that sort of made this really bizarre. Here we had a triple transient, or 3 bright points, basically vanishing within just 1 hour. As you can see, this was 19th of July 1952. And while here, pretty much all known astrophysical explanations so far failed to explain this, essentially opening the door for a lot of speculation and a lot of more exotic explanations, including of course our favorite topic, the extraterrestrial intelligence. With at least one study hinting that maybe, just maybe, this is artificial objects in orbit in the pre-Sputnik era. And this is of course what we've discussed in one of the previous videos you can find in the description. But before we let our imagination run wild, we really must ground ourselves in a lot of physical realities of 1950s technology, specifically photographic technology. Like for example, if you look at this image, you'll notice that it actually says POS1 red and POS1 blue. And this is where we basically have to start figuring out how this was actually done and what we're looking at. First of all, these are two completely different photographic plates. Photographic plates used for the Palomar Observatory Sky Survey, POS1. Or POS1 for short. And this involved glass-baked plates covered with the light-sensitive emulsions, approximately 14 inches across, and coated with silver halide photographic emulsion that was usually used in research. And well, as my hat initially suggested, the brand that they used for this was Kodak. And specifically, these were known as Kodak 103A, with the Type E for the red-sensitive observations and Type O for blue-sensitive observations, which is why the left one is called POS1 red and the right one is called POS1 blue. So they were actually sensitive to slightly different wavelengths. And so during these observations, a blue-sensitive plate was used for one exposure, followed by a red-sensitive plate approximately 30 minutes later to allow for color recording. And here the survey used approximately 2,000 different photographic plates, with the first plate used on November 11th, 1949, and the last one on December 10th, 1958. So this took approximately 9 years. But first of all, as you can see from this graph, they were not capturing exactly the same wavelengths, and so technically whatever was seen to the left side, in theory, could have been invisible to the right side. And so right here we already have our first explanation for these bizarre vanishing dots that does not involve exotic space phenomena. But when it comes to these photographic plates, and when it comes to their shortcomings, things actually go much deeper, especially when you consider when these pictures were taken and how a lot of the processing was actually done. Because in this case, the very imperfections and contaminations of the photographic plates do play a pretty big role in all of this as well. And so first, let's consider certain inherent flaws, because none of this was digitized and none of these were digital sensors. These were just glass plates covered with the light-sensitive emulsion. And as reported in several studies on the storage of these plates, over time, a lot of these glass plates can actually exhibit slight warping, usually due to exposure to moisture and temperature variations, with poor storage very often leading to image fading, bizarre tarnishing edges, or a lot of white spots. This was a pretty well-known problem for a lot of these plates, especially the ones used in the 1950s. Although within just a few decades, the technology improved quite a lot. And these were not minor issues. Here there were quite a lot of significant concerns for precise astronomical and scientific photography that was previously addressed in a lot of different studies. But beyond simple aging, the emulsion itself, the little layer that's on top of the glass plate, can also be a culprit. This was recently discussed and analyzed in a study by Hambly and Blair, specifically talking about these particular plates. And so this involved a critical examination of a lot of these observations and a lot of these disappearing stars, with the overall conclusion being that many of these unusual artifacts were probably the result of photographic emulsion. Specifically, the emulsion flaws, such as various bubbles or various holes, that could easily appear as dark spots on the copies that were later digitized. And this could actually appear as a true astronomical source. And crucially, by using machine learning, researchers behind the study identified something else very bizarre. All of these potentially disappearing objects exhibited much more narrow and much more round profile compared to a typical star on the same plate. And in this case, the machine learning algorithm was able to always identify one of these vanishing points just because they kind of look different. And so the algorithm classified all of these transients into the bad pixel category. But there was a follow-up study from the original scientists that tried to present a slightly different point, suggesting that the reason they're different and the reason that they do look rounder is actually because these are short-lived, sub-second optical flashes. Literally instant flashes of light that would maybe produce something similar. But in this case, a quick flash lasting less than a second, and specifically hundreds or even thousands of similar flashes, would actually suggest some kind of a systematic issue instead of just one isolated event. Or basically suggesting that for some reason, during these 1950s observations, there were a lot of bizarre flashes all over the night skies, flashes that would have no explanations, and flashes that no one else seemed to have noticed. But in this case, when it comes to my personal opinion, this 2024 study does provide another really important piece of evidence. They visually inspected some of these older glass plates, revealing various blemishes and tiny bubbles, or even holes inside the emulsion, which when copied would actually look a little bit different, resembling tiny stars. And so because at least a few of these plates contain these blemishes, it would not be unusual to expect a lot more that might have been missed before. But technically we've discussed all of this in that older video you can find in the description. Now let's talk about something slightly different and slightly new. And it's something that's going to involve Kodak once again. And you might have already seen one of these videos posted by Veritasium and a few other sources in regards to what happened to Kodak in 1945. Because the most insidious and the most unusual type of contamination that nobody expected comes from a somewhat grim chapter in human history: radioactive fallout from nuclear weapon tests. And so consider this. We have our first astronomical survey conducted by Palomar Observatory. The survey that started in 1949 and finished in 1958. And this time frame perfectly overlaps with the era of intense atmospheric nuclear weapon testing in the Nevada test site, which began its operations around 1951, with the closest major nuclear testing area extremely close to the Palomar Observatory. Here we're talking about under 200 kilometers or just over 100 miles. And the impact of this cannot be overstated, because it was actually Kodak that accidentally discovered the nuclear testing that began in 1945. And I think Veritasium talks about this on his channel, and there's maybe a few more videos in the description that discuss this in more detail, but this picture kind of tells the story as well. This paper shows us the effects of nuclear testing in 1945. Here, Kodak accidentally discovered that a lot of film they were selling seemed to contain a lot of dark spots and a lot of fogging that a lot of customers started to complain about. And it was Dr. Julian Webb, a Kodak scientist, that then investigated and discovered what happened. He traced the problem back to radioactive contaminants inside straw board packaging that was used for a lot of film and photographic plates. And intriguingly, it contained a contaminant known as cerium-141, a radioactive isotope with a very short half-life of 32 days that originated during 1945 Trinity atomic bomb test and subsequent explosions around the US. And while it turns out that a lot of this fallout was carried by wind and atmospheric currents settling into rivers, some of which were supplying water to various paper mills, including the one that Kodak used for its packaging. And it was the radioactive paper produced by these mills that was then causing a lot of Kodak film to contain these bizarre dark spots. And this was not a small problem. The problem became so severe that at some point, Kodak actually threatened to sue the US government for the damage to its products. But, as you probably know, a lot of this was top secret. And so the result was a secretive agreement between the US government and Kodak to essentially receive advance warnings of nuclear tests, along with certain forecasts, in order to prevent financial losses for Kodak, but also in order to prevent Kodak from basically making this public. And so this is a chilling fact that underscores the impact of nuclear fallout on a lot of sensitive photographic materials that was used in the 1950s. And this was widely known to a lot of government officials and a lot of employees in these companies. And although this was known to some scientists, the scientists using Palomar Observatory were not aware of this. And so there's actually a very high chance that they might have used contaminated plates. And because nuclear tests regularly dispersed radioactive debris across much of the continental United States, with a lot of winds taking the fallout to California, it would not be unusual to assume that, maybe just maybe, what we're seeing here is actually related to radioactive fallout. And so when we see these mysterious vanishing dots, it is easy to get carried away by exotic possibilities. Aliens. But the historical evidence and the physical evidence paints a much more grounded yet equally remarkable picture for at least a subset of some of these detections. As a matter of fact, there's a high chance that a lot of this could be direct evidence of this being a pervasive contamination in a lot of early scientific data, suggesting that a lot of these plates, especially in certain locations not so far from the nuclear test sites, may have been exposed and might not be very reliable. Because here, nuclear test artifacts can easily produce streaks, fogging, and bright spots resembling something like this. And so while this debate continues, and while researchers try to figure out exactly what some of these dots are, right now the collective evidence for widespread photographic plate imperfections, along with the known facts of contamination from Cold War nuclear fallout, does present us with a very robust and scientifically grounded alternative explanation that doesn't involve unusual astrophysical effects, does not involve aliens, but basically just your good old nuclear fallout, while also reminding us that interpreting some of this historical data requires deep understanding not just of what we're looking at, but sometimes also how a lot of this is processed and what was really happening around the same time in the vicinity. And so in this case, the mundane reality of the 1950s, and specifically this early photographic technology, along with super secretive nuclear tests and even atmospheric nuclear tests, offer us a very powerful, plausible, scientifically supported explanation for a lot of these, if not all of these, anomalies. And so while the universe is indeed full of wonders and we still have so much more to discover, we simply just cannot ignore the fact that the historical and scientific data for this seems to point to human activity, and specifically nuclear tests, as a very plausible and a very significant contributor to these perplexing vanishing objects. And so let me know what you think in the comments below, but we'll definitely discuss this more once there are additional studies or additional observations and maybe someone else's analysis. Until then, check out previous videos in the description. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. Alternatively, you can also buy the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.